Committee, please come back to order. We're in the final stretch. But more applause from the audience and members.
Work.
Mr. Barton, you have some amendments on your side, and let's
Mr. Chairman,
bring them up.
We have two in block.
We dispose of the pending amendments? Yes.
Did we?
Did we?
Yes, it was withdrawn.
Oh, yes.
That's correct.
Right. Okay.
Mr. Radonovich is going to offer an in-block amendment, which would be Radonovich 09, Deal 005, Upton 20, Shattuck 1, Shattuck 501B, and Walden Hydro 5. I think.
Okay.
Recognize him, Mr.
Yeah, let's give the clerks a chance to find these so that we can have them distributed and have the right ones distributed.
It's Mr. Chairman.
Just wait a minute.
Radonovich 9 and
Okay.
Deal 5.
Radonovich 9
And Deal 5.
and Deal 5, and what else?
That's it.
Upton 20, Shattuck 1,
Upton 20, Shattuck 1,
Shattuck 501B,
Shattuck 50. So Shattuck's got two amendments in there, 501B.
and Waldron Hydro 5.
Serve a point of order.
The gentlelady reserves a point of order.
And make sure that Booyer knows that he's off on all of those.
On the first one, yes. Okay.
On this one. Okay. We're doing this one now. Radonovich. Yeah, Radonovich.
Okay, you started with the second. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. You're in the next one. It's all right.
Okay.
We just divided into two, so. Okay, Shattuck. Okay.
Where are we at?
I'm just doing what you told me.
I know, you are. Unfortunately, I didn't look enough for you, so.
We didn't make enough copies?
Yeah.
Well, while they get them, let me grab them.
Wait,
Oh, you didn't make copies
give them
of that.
time to find these amendments since they're.
Clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Radonovich at the end of Title III. Insert the following new.
Amendment will be considered as read. Chair will withdraw her reservation and recognize Mr. Radonovich for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My amendment is the Agriculture Jobs Off-Ramp Amendment, and I happen to represent the Great Central Valley in California. We produce and grow some of the best fruits and vegetables, not just for California, but for the entire country, and it's got a large export component of it as well. And right now we're suffering mightily, not because of the global warming bill, but because the Endangered Species Act, which protects a worthless little worm that is going extinct, and it's shut down the pumps, and it's costing the people of the Central Valley 40,000 jobs this year and a loss of $2 billion of income in the state's largest industry. Now, as I'd mentioned, this is not due to global warming. It's due to the abuses of a well-intentioned law that was written in 1974, the Endangered Species Act, that's run amok and creating an enormous amount of job losses. My concern is that this type of environmental alarmism is going to be the result of this global warming bill and its adverse impacts on the price of agricultural input costs, not just in California, but all across the country. My fear is that this bill will increase the price of gas or diesel, natural gas, electricity, fertilizer, cars, trucks, tractors, and trailers, transportation in the form of rail, truck, and plane, machine parts, and traditional agriculture tools. This bill, I believe, will disproportionately punish low and middle class families in my district, many of whom are traditionally agriculture workers. And if these agriculture jobs are lost, we will mostly be more dependent on foreign sources for our food supply. If you like buying oil from Hugo Chavez, you're going to love buying your breakfast, lunch, and dinner from him as well, because these types of increased costs on California agriculture and American agriculture will force these industries offshore and in different countries. And that's why I'm dropping this legislation, this amendment that would require the Secretary of Labor to report back on the number of agriculture jobs lost nationally. And if it reaches 5%, the provisions of this act will cease to be effective. I want to thank you for the consideration of this bill and yield to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shadig.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I appreciate his proportion of this en-bloc amendment. I have two pieces in it. One deals with the issue of essentially the foreign aid provision in this legislation. This legislation calls for spending money by giving it to other countries to purchase clean technology from the United States. Unfortunately, it talks about the expenditure of billions of dollars, minimum of $6.374 billion in the time period from 2012 to 2021, another $7.977 billion from 2022 to 2026, another $81 billion in the period 2027 to 2050, for a total minimum of over $95 billion, which we give away to foreign countries to buy clean technology. As worthy as that goal may be, there are many here in this country who think that money would be better spent in the United States. My amendment simply says it should go instead to low-income consumers here in the United States. The second amendment, which I have, recognizes the legitimate stake that states have in this issue, and that is we have concern on our side of the aisle about employment. We've offered many different avenues to try to address increasing unemployment in this legislation, or as a result of this legislation. All of those amendments have been rejected. This is yet another attempt. This is an attempt that would say that if, as a result of this legislation, unemployment goes up in a given state by more than 2%, then that state may opt out of Title III by one of three things: a declaration by its governor, a piece of legislation by its legislature opting out, or a vote of its people. This is a recognition that it is the people who will be impacted. They have local officials who represent them, and that some portions of the country are being adversely affected at the moment, much worse than others. For example, my friends from Michigan, which face the highest unemployment in the nation. And I would strongly urge the adoption of these two amendments and yield back my time to Mr. Radonovich.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I just want to say I was glad to have my amendment included as part of this as well. As Mr. Shattuck said, There is no bigger issue in the Midwest, let alone Michigan, than the jobs issue. And yesterday, our unemployment numbers came out, and they're almost 13%. And we're well on the way to the dire prediction of perhaps 20% by the end of the summer. And what my amendment does is this. I know that we saved Mr. Wilder's job, who did a terrific job as one of the reading clerks there for a minute or two, going through 40 or 50 pages, as I understand it. But as we look at this bill itself, we're going to see a lot of jobs go someplace else, a lot more than just Mr. Wilder's. And what my amendment says is that if there's a greater than a 10% unemployment rate across the country, that we would cease the transfer of money to foreign entities and instead divert it to worker training for people who lost their jobs in this country. It's a good amendment. It's part of this one, the en bloc, and I'd like to think that it would be considered. I yield back to the gentleman from California.
Gentleman's time's expired.
I thank the gentleman and yield back the time I don't have.
For gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the gentlelady very much. We've had this discussion over and over again, and it has manifested itself in different ways, but it all comes down to the same decision which we have to make. And that is whether or not we believe that the legislation which we are considering is going to create a new generation of green jobs. Whether or not it's going to lead to developing the domestic capacity for us to begin to back out that 13 million barrels of oil a day, which we consume from overseas. That's the choice. This particular iteration, this particular formulation, is one that gives to the EPA administrator the ability to make a determination regarding job losses. In this case, the cessation of the operation of the legislation is tied to job losses in the agriculture industry. We fundamentally reject, on our side of the aisle, this level of pessimism with regard to the opportunities which this legislation is going to present, especially in the agricultural sector, especially in the offsets sections of the legislation, especially with regard to the solar and to the wind, which is going to be possible out in the rural parts of this country. We fundamentally reject it. And to tie the long-term implementation of this legislation to a determination by the administrator of the EPA would be to fundamentally destroy the confidence which the investors, not only of our country, but the world would have in this program. We are trying to create some confidence, some long-term predictability that will lead us to a new generations of jobs, not just in urban America, but here empowering rural America. They have a huge role in the effort that this legislation is going to unleash. And so we've already cast this vote at least a half a dozen times. There have been a different number of approaches which have been taken to derail this bill, to create off-ramps which end the ability for this legislation to be implemented. But at the end of the day, the vote must be no. There's a new dawn of energy job creation, which this bill will signal by the end of this evening. And I urge the members not to allow a decision made by an EPA administrator to end it, because that will be the top line of every memo written in every investment banking firm in the world about whether or not they should be investing in the new technologies that we are trying to unleash.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I mean, let me yield first to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you for yielding. Very quickly, there's been a lot of discussion of these off-ramps. And conceptually, what I've arrived at is that we're on this highway, and every proposal that the other side has put forward is designed to take an off-ramp from the future. We're never going to get to where we need to get if we keep putting our blinker on and taking the next off-ramp. And meanwhile, as we're getting off the highway, These other countries are continuing on and passing us by. And that's the danger here. So whether it's a small off-ramp or the giant off-ramp in the form of the substitute that was offered a little while ago, we can't afford to stop this forward progress, and I would urge people to reject this proposal.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will reclaim my time. The Shattuck and the Upton amendments also shift the emission allowances away from the International Clean Technology Deployment Program, and there too we're trying to create partnerships so that we can have a global approach to these issues. I don't think that this approach makes any sense whatsoever, but I'll be glad to yield to whoever it is that is seeking recognition. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Just a quick comment. My amendment is not an off-ramp. It is a diversion of the money back to worker training, but I just like to know if the gentleman knows how much money is in this bill for the international fund and how much money is in there for worker training for those that are displaced because of the act. And like Mr. Shimkus, I know the answer, I think, and I'll let the...
For the international programs?
How many, I'll put it this way, do you know how many times greater the international fund is over the displaced worker fund? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5?
No, the international worker, the workers program is essentially 1% of the allocation, and the international program, I think, is approximately 1% of the, including adaptation to the program.
Gentleman's time's expired. The vote now occurs.
Madam Chairwoman, I would seek recognition and support also. We agreed to
Does the gentleman ask unanimous consent to be recognized for 2 minutes?
If I need unanimous consent, I didn't know I needed it. Well, we agreed to 10 minutes on each side.
Oh, okay, the gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. One of the amendments in this in-block amendment is an amendment by Congressman Deal of Georgia, who is not here, and I think it is worthy of some explanation. He would set up a public information program where the Secretary of Labor would make a quarterly calculation of the number of adversely affected workers receiving payments under Section 425, which is the Climate Change Worker Assistance Program. Now, in spite of the protestations of many of the supporters of this legislation that there's not going to be any negative economic impact, there are close to 100 pages in the legislation going through the Climate Change Worker Adjustment Assistance Program, and workers who are eligible for such assistance include workers employed in the energy producing and transforming industries dependent upon energy industries, energy-intensive manufacturing industries, consumer goods manufacturing, and other industries whose employment the Secretary determines has been adversely affected by any requirement of Title VII of the Clean Air Act. So apparently somebody believes that in spite of what we've heard for the last 4 days, there are going to be some negative economic impacts. And in this bill, in addition to the normal unemployment benefits that we have already, this creates an additional program, as I understand it, on top of. And so the Deal Amendment would simply say that you have to make a quarterly calculation of those adversely affected workers and put it up on a website that would be maintained by the Department of Energy. It's an informational amendment. So it is part of the in-block, and I thought that deserved to have some time. And I think I would yield to Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to speak toward the Walden amendment on hydropower. And first of all, this is water. You pour it in here, and it's the same water you pour in here. And under this bill, this water going through one dam produces electricity that has no carbon footprint, but it's not renewable. If you go through a different one, it is, depending upon the year. And I'd like to know from the chairman why January 1 of 1992 was picked as the year before which this water that goes through this dam isn't renewable, and if it goes through after it, it is. Who made the decision on 1992?
Chair will defer to Mr. Markey.
Mr. Markey, can you inform me?
In the same way that 2005 is used as a benchmark, or 2020 is used as a benchmark, that number was chosen after considerable deliberation, reflecting upon a large set of construction projects that actually had reached their culmination point during that time period. And it was felt that it would make sense to include them because it would help actually then in making a...
I'm going to reclaim my time and go to the next piece of this amendment because I'm using up time here, but I'd love to get the list of those projects. Clause 3, however, on page 15, says that the hydro project installed in the dam is operated so that the water surface elevation at any given location and time that would have occurred in the absence of the hydroelectric project is maintained. In other words, if you put an electrical generation device on a dam, the energy produced for that device is not considered as new hydro and renewable if at any location or time the water behind that dam is affected by the addition of that electrical generating device, that turbine. I have talked to engineers from the Corps of Engineers who tell me it is physically impossible not to do that. And so therefore, while we've heard a lot of talk on that side about how we're going to encourage new hydro, the practical and engineering effect of Clause 3 precludes that new hydro from ever being considered. And so our amendment fixes both of these issues, and I urge its support.
Does any member wish to be recognized in opposition to the en bloc amendment?
Yes, Madam Chairman.
Gentleman from California.
Thank you. I just want to respond to some comments by my colleague from California, and I certainly appreciate the concern about farm jobs. I have a lot of agriculture in my district, and we're seeing huge decreases in the withdrawals for the Delta. But the Delta smelt, which was referred to as the worthless worm, is the base of the Delta food chain, and it is going extinct. But it's only resulted in about 300,000 acre-feet reduction. That's only 5% of the withdrawal from the Delta. Now, the real cause of the low, extremely low, damagingly low withdrawals is 3 consecutive years of very low rainfall, and that is consistent with global warming. I don't know if it can be blamed on it or not, but certainly consistent, and 50 years of overdrafting the Delta. So I'm very concerned about blaming this bill, and we'll see that as we move forward, for all the problems we're having in California and and other environmental laws for damaging the state. I think the environmental laws are making our state healthier and making our country healthier. For example, the Clean Water Act. Where would we be now without the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1990? So the arguments that were given forth on that, I don't think carry water. And so I urge my colleagues to vote against that.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield.
Does the gentleman support the closure of the pumps in the Delta due to the Delta smelt decision, the Wanger decision?
The Delta withdrawal is due to very low water.
Does the gentleman support the decision, the Wanger decision, to shut the pumps down for the Delta smelt?
That decision was made in the judicial area, so I can't
Can the gentleman
really
from California answer yes or no on that?
No, the gentleman is not going to answer yes or no on that.
Would the
I suggest the gentleman does support that decision.
Would the gentleman from
Gentleman from California controls the time.
Would the gentleman from California yield?
Yes, I yield back to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the gentleman very much, and that just so that all members can know that the language in the bill has been endorsed by the National Hydropower Association. So I think
were they part, Mr. Chairman, will you yield? Were they part of?
Gentleman from California
the
controls
gentleman
the
from
time.
California has time. I just thought everyone should know that We think the language in the bill.
Would the gentleman from California yield for a question to the chairman of the committee, since he raised the Hydropower Association? I just have a question. Did they give the list?
The gentleman has not. Does the gentleman yield?
Okay, so thank you for yielding. Because my question is, so the Hydropower Association, so they support Clause 3 on page 15? And did they provide the list of the facilities and come up with the date?
The National Hydropower Association, in conjunction with American Rivers Association, drafted the language that is actually used for the production tax credit as well. So we tried to work with groups that are out there, and we believe that we reached a good formula, and we look forward to working with the gentleman in the weeks ahead.
And would you be willing to provide me that list of the dams or electric facilities since 92 that took you back to that 92 date? Because your discussion draft from the week before had a different date, and that's why.
We will provide the information to them.
I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
The gentleman from California yield back. Gentleman yields back. The vote now occurs on the en bloc amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam Chairman, we would ask for a roll call vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes no. Yeah. Oh, Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Melanson? He's not here. Where is he? What? I'm sorry, I can't see him. He votes no. Ms. Melanson votes no. I got him. Mr. Welch. Oh, Mr. Welch. I'm sorry. Mr. Welch votes no. Anybody on this side? Mr. Deal. Okay. That's what I have.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? The clerk will tally the vote and announce the outcome.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 22 ayes and 36 noes.
22 ayes, 36 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.